Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Monday to you. The meeting will come to order. This is a regular meeting of the Land Use and Transportation Committee. I am Supervisor Malia Cohen, chair of this committee, and to my right is Supervisor Scott Wehner, who is the vice chair. My left is Supervisor Aaron Peskin. Our clerk is Miss Andrea Osbury, and I'd like to take a moment to thank our faithful staffers at SF Gov TV, Phil Jackson and Jesse Larson, for broadcasting this meeting. Madam Clerk, do you have any announcements?
Yes, please silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today may appear on the June 14th, 2016 Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Thank you. Could you please call item 1?
Item number 1 is an ordinance amending the administrative code for rent control for tenants and housing opportunities for persons with AIDS program.
All right. Supervisor Wehner is the author of this item.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Colleagues, this legislation will close a pretty glaring and troubling loophole in our city's rent ordinance, one that denies full rent control protection to a population of long-term HIV survivors, low-income HIV survivors who do not receive rent control in connection with their federal rent subsidy. Colleagues, as you know, low-income people living with HIV/AIDS are some of our most vulnerable residents. Several hundred of them participate in the HOPWA program, Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, which is a federal rent subsidy program for low-income people with HIV. These are frequently long-term survivors, and they're frequently seniors. These are people who have gone to hell and back as part of our HIV/AIDS epidemic, and they deserve our support. These people need housing security, and they cannot afford dramatic increases in their rent. As a city, we need to do everything we can to protect these residents and ensure that they remain stable in their housing and in their community. Currently, within our rent ordinance, any recipient of a HOPWA subsidy is excluded from the rent increase protections that exist for other recipients of federal vouchers like Section 8 tenants. This means that two neighbors in a rent-controlled building, one who receives a HOPWA subsidy and one who receives, for example, a Section 8 subsidy, have different protections under the rent ordinance, with the HOPWA recipient receiving fewer protections. This makes no sense whatsoever. People living with HIV/AIDS need housing security, and they need rent control. It is unclear why this exemption was included in the ordinance back in the day when it was adopted, as federal law does not in any way require that this loophole exists. When we learned about this loophole, we asked around, and no one can recall why it is even there. But regardless, we know about it now, and we have it within our power to eliminate this loophole, to fix this problem with this very simple piece of legislation extending rent protections to HOPWA recipients. HOPWA subsidy is based on the difference between the lower of either the established rent standard or the reasonable rent of the unit and 30% of the tenant's income. For example, this could mean that if the rent of a HOPWA recipient studio is $1,500 a month and 30% of the tenant's income is $1,000, then the HOPWA subsidy is $500, the difference. However, if that same tenant sees his or her $1,500 rent increased to $2,000, the HOPWA subsidy doesn't cover that increase because it's above the federal ceiling. And that tenant is responsible for that $500. That is a significant rent increase that could push people out of their housing. And under our rent ordinance, that increase would not in any way be precluded. This ordinance will close that loophole. We have also made the effective date of the legislation May 17th, 2016, which is the day on which we introduced the legislation. We wanted to make sure that there was not even a small window of time for landlords to learn about this loophole and to take advantage of it. I want to thank President Breed for waiving the 30-day rule on this legislation to allow us to expedite its passage. I want to thank the chair for quickly and expeditiously calendaring the item. I also want to thank my co-sponsors, Supervisor Campos, President Breed, and I believe, Madam Chair, you had added your name as well, if I'm not mistaken. So if you could please add Supervisor Cohen's name as a co-sponsor. And I want to thank the AIDS Legal Referral Panel for its advocacy on this issue, as well as the San Francisco Apartment Association, which supports the legislation as well. Colleagues, we have an opportunity to take a step forward in protecting some of our most vulnerable residents and making sure that we close this loophole. I ask for your support.
Thank you, Supervisor Wiener. Would it be all right if we went to public comment at this time?
Yes.
All right,
and
great.
I will note that the Mayor's Office of Housing is here to answer any questions that may arise about HOPWA.
All right, thank you. I've got three speaker cards in front of me: Jamie Rush, Bill Hirsch, Jordan Gwendolyn Davis. If there's anyone else that'd like to speak at this time, you could speak after these three speakers. First up is Jamie. Next will be Bill, followed by Jordan Gwendolyn Davis.
Thank you. My name is Jamie Rush. I'm a staff attorney with the AIDS Legal Referral Panel, and I am speaking in support of the proposed amendment. For the last 10 years, I've assisted clients living with HIV and AIDS in legal matters related to their housing. And I can tell you that when folks are at the point of seeking out an attorney, they're scared. They're not in a good place. Many of my clients are confronting a reality that they never even contemplated, which is surviving long enough to confront issues of aging. We all know by now that for people living with HIV and AIDS, the ability to maintain their health is really only possible if they have long-term access to stable and affordable housing. And at the same time, this very population is facing immeasurable obstacles in obtaining and retaining such housing. Programs like the HOPWA voucher program are meant to address the obstacles and give lower-income HIV-positive tenants the stability that they need to stay healthy. The current unprecedented surge in San Francisco's rental market exposed a serious deficiency, as Supervisor Wiener described. The protections afforded to HOPWA tenants were unequal to those of other federally subsidized tenants. Imagine being told that simply because you receive an HIV/AIDS specific funding source, that there's no legal protection against a massive rent increase that your landlord is imposing, and that your neighbor who has a Section 8 subsidy can fight the increase, but that you cannot, and that your only choices are either to stay in your housing and lose your subsidy, or to move without your subsidy and face the impossible task of finding new housing. The language that Supervisor Wiener's amendment targets is just a few words, but those few words will have a life-changing impact for people in the HOPWA program. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bill Hirsch.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Thank you, Supervisor Wiener, for your leadership on this issue. The AIDS Legal Referral Panel strongly supports this modest amendment, which would simply create equitable legal protections for assisted tenants living with HIV and AIDS. As it stands, the rent ordinance makes a distinction between low-income tenants who receive rental assistance through the federal Section 8 program and those whose rental assistance is through the federal HOPWA program. While neither class of tenants enjoys the full scope of rent increase protections under the ordinance, Section 8 assisted tenants are afforded such protections under some circumstances. HOPWA assisted tenants, on the other hand, are completely exempt from rent increase protections under all circumstances. Supervisor Wiener's proposed amendment will get rid of this illogical distinction so that long-term survivors of AIDS, whose ability to maintain their health is entirely dependent on having stable housing, will not be disproportionately faced with rent increases that force them out of their homes. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jordan Gwendolyn Davis.
Good afternoon. I'm a housing rights advocate. My name's Jordan Gwendolyn Davis, and I would like to thank you for considering this bill that would establish rent protections for people on HOPWA funding. I 100% support this, though given what's going on in this city, it may be too little too late, but we'll get to that shortly. Though I am HIV negative, I'm a disabled transgender woman, and I believe in solidarity across disabilities and acknowledge that many of my sisters have astronomical rates of HIV and AIDS. Being homeless is no fun. Being homeless can be deadly, but especially so for people with compromised immune systems. I am glad that this is being considered, but sadly it can only apply to current tenants. Those that have already been gentrified and evicted out are still out of luck. If ACT UP has taught us about anything, it's that silence equals death, but also gentrification equals death, homelessness equals death, and criminalization equals death. And that message is still relevant today as it was in the 80s. That said, though I 100% support this legislation, as I said, it is my belief that the prime sponsor is only doing this so he can pinkwash his history of gentrifying the mission, criminalizing the homeless, demonizing the poor, undermining rent control, and shilling for the SFPD. And these things are all bad for people with AIDS, HIV and AIDS and the LGBT community. Mr. Weiner, you've only cared about those who line your pockets with dirty money like anti-rent control Thomas Coates, who gave you $16,000 this March. Now you're doing something nice, too little, too late, just for brownie points and to divide the conquer the tenants movement. We stand in solidarity and see right through you. Go back to New Jersey.
Well, that was incredibly mean and unprofessional. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Charlie Goss. I work on government affairs for the San Francisco Apartment Association. We are asking for you to support this legislation, to not make any amendments, to move this forward to the full board. We believe this makes perfect sense, and we would appreciate your support. We appreciate the outreach Supervisor Weiner's office did with our office. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak on item number 1? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed at this time. Thank you. Colleagues, is there any discussion? If not, I can entertain a motion.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and colleagues, again, thank you for hearing this item, and I move that we forward the item to the full Board of Supervisors with a positive recommendation.
All right, motion has been made, and without objection, that motion passes unanimously. Madam Clerk, could you call item 2?
Item number 2 is an ordinance dedicating city jurisdictional property on a portion of State Trust Parcel 2, known as Mission Bay Park P6.
All right, great, thank you. We've got April Veneracion from Supervisor Kim's office here. She's going to be presenting on this item.
Thank you, Chair Cohen and Land Use Committee. My name again is April Veneracion Ng. I will have very, very brief comments here today as to what is before you, but it is a formal acceptance for DPW to accept Mission Bay Kids Park. As you know, Mission Bay is a new and emerging neighborhood. It's in a former redevelopment area with many, many new families and children, and many of the families have been anxious to have this park open. And so this is an important step in that process, is to have the city accept the park on behalf of OCII and Mission Bay Parks. It will be a unique park for tots to school-age children. I just want to thank President Breed, who has also waived the regular 30-day review, as well as Chair Cohen for also scheduling this as a committee report so that we could have the ordinance passed and so that the park can open. I also, we do have one amendment to the legislation that I believe Supervisor Peskin will move, and that is to make the operative date of the legislation July 1st to enable this park opening. I believe DPW is here if there are any other questions from the committee. Thank you.
Mr. Peskin? Oh, excuse me, Supervisor Weiner.
Yes, just a question to, I guess, to Supervisor Kim's office. So who's going to be operating this? It's a park, but my understanding is it's not Rec and Park. So who's going to be managing and running this?
Yes, Barbara Moy is here from DPW, but it is in the Mission Bay redevelopment area, a former redevelopment area. It will be maintained and managed by the Mission Bay Parks. It's, I believe it's MJM will be managing the park.
Good afternoon, Barbara Moy from Public Works. MJM is will be under contract to the OCII to manage the parks. They're funded through a CFD, which is a financing mechanism which will help those parks stay alive and vigorous over the years.
Okay, and why is Rec and Park not involved here?
This has been the way they've been managed for probably the last 15 years. It was a redevelopment area and set up to be managed by the former redevelopment agency. That's up to discussion, obviously, in the future as OCII eventually will be dissolved.
Okay, and I just, I know I've some concern has been expressed to me, and again, this is, I've never received a briefing on this. I'm not saying that anyone needed to. We don't get briefed on every item on the agenda. But I know that there are some concerns. I think Rec and Park learned about this, or they're starting to be briefed on it like last week, from what I understand. And it's sort of, and MJM is terrific. I think they do a phenomenal job in a lot of areas. But we have a Rec and Park department. Everyone assumes that all of our parks are under their jurisdiction, but then there are parks that are not under their jurisdiction, and I think that brings some challenges along with it.
I think it's a very valid policy discussion that should be continued. Agree?
Okay, I'd be curious to know what the authors, and I don't want to put you on the spot.
I've some staff from OCII here that might want to address that.
Just because there's several former redevelopment areas and current OCII areas in our district, most of the park activities within those areas are managed through MJM or some similar, or I think it's actually MJM, and the one that comes off the top of my head is the Yerba Buena Gardens is a similar structure, as well as the coming Trans Bay Park in the Trans Bay area, and all of the parks within Mission Bay, of which there are several, also have this similar structure, where OCII continues to hold the park while the management company MJM manages it and maintains it.
Supervisor Mark Slutskin with OCII. I'm 2 months new, so I don't know all the legislation process, but the way OCII in the Mission Bay has their parks is they have OCII has a lease agreement with the city in the Department of Real Estate, and from that they hire MJM to manage all the parks, while the OCII is still responsible for the redevelopment area. I know that there's been discussions at the higher level that my executive director has been talking with Park and Rec about what happens.
Yeah, I just, whenever I get sort of an expression of, or questions from Rec and Park about how park property is going to be managed, and I think that they're now being briefed, and I'm just a little confused. I mean, the city family seems to be not necessarily, and I hate that phrase, but I'll use it just for ease of reference, seems to not all be on the same page on this, and I don't, I'm a little confused by that.
Okay.
I don't expect you to answer.
Yeah, no, like I said, I know there have been discussions. I'm not sure if it's been a week or more, but I know there has been discussions with Park and Rec, and they've been talking, the director with my director, about the future.
Okay.
I can't. I'm sorry. I don't have more history.
And this is a committee report.
Yes.
Is there something magic about tomorrow as opposed to the 14th? Or
Well, we can open up for public
Okay.
comment, and it looks like we've got someone, Corinne, out there that might want to speak. Thank you for your time. You can go.
And I'm happy to weigh in. I do have an amendment, and the amendment is a very simple amendment on page 5, but speaks to the length of time that it's actually taken to finally open this facility. And I am proposing on behalf of the chief sponsor, Supervisor Kim, to add a section 5, which would read, the action set forth in this ordinance in its section 3, including acceptance of Part P6 for city and OCII maintenance and liability purpose, shall be operative as of July 1, 2016. But really what that speaks to is the fact that this has taken quite a long time, has been the subject of many delays. I actually asked a similar question to the question that Supervisor Weiner is asking of DPW staff, which is, why is this not being titled up to Rec and Park? And I may be coming at it from a slightly different policy reason, which is that I actually think going forward, as we create these new parks in expanding areas of the city, they should be parks that are under the jurisdiction of Rec and Park, which is subject to the voter-approved mandate Proposition K relative to shadow impacts. So I am interested in, over the long term, having a public policy discussion about ultimately transferring this property to the Recreation and Parks Department. But given the evolution of Mission Bay, given the fact that there are many people who have been patiently waiting for this, DPW is still in the process of accepting streets around that park that have not yet been publicly accepted. I think the scheme that has been proposed by staff, OCII, and DPW is one that I'm prepared to move forward with, and that does not in any way preclude us in the future as the Board of Supervisors from working with Rec and Park, OCII, and DPW to ultimately achieve a transfer to Rec and Park. Although I do have to say that I know that there are many residents in that area that are worried about Rec and Park's ability to properly manage the facility and given their funding and other constraints. So with that, subject to public comment, I would like to move the amendment and respectfully send this forward as a committee report so that we can finally get this park open for the people who have been moving into that increasingly dense part of town.
Did you read into the amendment?
I did.
Okay.
I read it.
So it was that simple?
It's that simple.
Okay.
And if I may, Supervisor Bacon, thank you for those comments, which seem very reasonable and appropriate to me. So I appreciate that clarification.
All right, thank you, Supervisor Weiner and Supervisor Peskin. Let's go ahead and open up for public comment at this time. If you'd like to come up, please do so. I have one card from Ms. Corinne Woods. Please join us. You'll have 2 minutes at the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Cohen.
Good afternoon.
Supervisor Weiner, Supervisor Peskin. My name is Corinne Woods. I chair the Mission Bay Citizens Advisory Committee and have been working very hard for a long time with the community to get this park open. I want to thank Supervisor Kim's office and the OCII staff and Barbara Moy's Infrastructure Task Force for pulling this all together. Nothing in Mission Bay is simple. There are 17 different agencies that have to sign off on everything, and it has been extremely frustrating, as is every acceptance in Mission Bay, to watch hundreds of children looking at this park from the outside. I really appreciate your waiving the waiting period on this, and I don't quite understand Supervisor Peskin's amendment, but does that mean that it would waive the 30-day after enactment rule, and we really could open it up by the beginning of July? Because if so, I'm starting to plan a party to which you all are invited. We've been planning the party for about 1.5 years to get this, waiting to get this park open. On the larger issue of park management, the community has some very definite opinions about the future, and I would very much like to speak to you all or any of you that are interested in hearing how we feel about this transition. Thank you.
If I could just ask Ms. Wood, thank you for your advocacy and incredible work for many years in Mission Bay. But is there Supervisor Peskin referenced a concern about whether Rec and Park has the resources to care for these parks? Has there been a discussion about who should be ultimately managing?
There has been a significant discussion where we've been working with OCII for a couple of years on this. The Community Facilities District that funds the Mission Bay Parks the money actually is controlled by OCII. OCII has to divest itself of Mission Bay Parks by order of the State Department of Finance. We're hoping that we can work out something like Yerba Buena Gardens is working out, which is not to go to Rec and Park because we don't want that CFD money intermingled with Rec and Park funding. And we're hoping to put together a not-for-profit, the way Yerba Buena is putting together a not-for-profit, that would have community stakeholder involvement in the management of the parks. We're very happy with MJM's management. We feel they do a really excellent job in terms of janitorial, security, and park maintenance in general. And we want to be sure that this doesn't become an ugly stepchild, because Mission Bay really has got a very vested interest in making sure this works well after OCII goes away. And the community is very engaged and would be very happy to speak to you about it.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Woods.
Are there any other members that would like to speak on this item? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed at this time. Thank you. All right. Is there, Supervisor Weiner?
That was from before.
No? Okay, thank you. Thank you to Supervisor Kim's office for bringing this before us. To the Corinne, thank you for being an advocate on this item. Colleagues, is there a motion for this? This is, again, agendized as a committee report. So.
And can we move the amendment?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So without objection, the amendments are accepted. Thank you.
And Ms. Woods, it does exactly what you asked.
And so this item will move as a committee report forward to the full board as amended.
Actually, can I just comment?
Oh, yes.
So first of all, I want to thank Supervisor Peskin for answering some of the questions that I had, and also Ms. Woods for answering some questions as well. Obviously, this is a really terrific project, and I think I'll support moving this forward with a positive recommendation. I do think, and I'm glad that there are conversations going on about long-term how to manage these parks, and I think relative to what Supervisor Peskin said about questions about whether Rec and Park would have the resources to manage these parks in addition to the other 220 park properties it manages, that's really I think a statement about how how this building has starved our park system for many, many years, and it's really frankly, even with Prop B, if it passes, our Rec and Park is just so vastly under-resourced, and I think it's really a sad state of affairs that we start wondering, are they going to have the resources they need to take care of additional parks? It's just that should not even be a factor. We need to make sure that our parks have the support that they need, and that includes expanded parks. But I know that conversation will continue, and it obviously is a broader policy discussion around a whole set of parks. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. So, Madam Clerk, the motion has been made and it's been accepted. And without objection, let's move this item as a committee report.
Recommend as amended as a committee report by Supervisor Weiner.
That is correct,
right.
And without objection. Thank you. Are there any other items before us?
There's no further business before the committee.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.